Hello, everybody. Venerable Children is out of town. I believe she's back next week to teach, and then maybe gone the few weeks after that. The days that she's gone, the people in the community are going to do a review. So tonight I'll start with a review of the first 3 weeks that she taught the mind training text, mind training like the rays of the sun. And then the other weeks when she's gone, other people will be doing usually about a 3-week review. So we'll start by setting our motivation. So I'm thinking about motivation for studying the Dharma. Really, it's about changing our minds and using the teachings to help us to be more useful during the day in this life, and also to think about our future lives and how we can be of the most benefit. As we go through our day and relating with different people and different situations and family, it's always this constant up and down, all these different things happening. And for myself, the Buddha's teachings really have been like a raft, a place of safety, and a whole view that's made things make much more sense, much less confusion. And so I see that the Buddha knew what he was talking about, and by following these teachings and putting them into practice, both moment by moment, things can be better, and we can be of much more use in this life and all future lives. So let's think about becoming enlightened, which is our potential, so that we can help every being, so everyone can be free of every kind of suffering, all sentient beings. So this was a lot of fun. I enjoy having the focus, and I hope to share that with you. As I read through and listened to the different teachings, there was one quote that especially stood out for me, and it was the prayer of devotion that the author of this text, Nam Kapel, wrote. And so I just wanted to start with this quote because I feel it sums up a lot of what this is about. And it also makes me think a lot about Venerable Chodron and all of our great teachers. So he said, excuse me, arising from the source of love and compassion, the ship of the awakening mind is well launched. Above it billow the great sails of the 6 perfections and the 4 ways of amassing disciples, which are driven by the wind of enthusiastic effort that never slackens. Perfectly it carries embodied beings across the ocean of cyclic existence, landing them on the wish-fulfilling jewel, island of omniscience. And so that's really what these teachings are about. When I was first introduced to these teachings, and for some period of time, I ran into some difficulty with them, and I wanted to speak about that first, because I think that one thing was I didn't understand really the purpose of them. And there's some times where I've taken some of the Buddhist teachings and used them very much for my worldly, day-to-day things. And these teachings are clearly, the motivation is bodhicitta, or the awakening mind. And I think the reason I find that to be important is because once in a while, some of the other things that I've found as difficulties with the mind training teachings relate to previous experiences with things that are like this. And one of them was, I worked with a coach once who really, really emphasized positive mental attitude. And I found her to be quite a negative person. and it wasn't very skillful. Of all the coaches I worked with for like some 10 years or whatever that I was, or 15 maybe, I can't remember how many years I was quite involved with working with athletic teams. She was one of the difficult, of only maybe two, you know. And I always thought that was kind of strange. And so when I just thought about that today, I hadn't thought about that before, but I realized the problem there is she didn't have, like, the difference is these teachings are very deep and vast, and they've been thought about and they've been given to us by somebody who's omniscient. And so rather than kind of like a weekend seminar made up thing or whatever it was that she was using that worked very well when she was coaching on the high school level, it didn't work too well when she was on the college level. It actually quite backfired. So that really, that made me think that these teachings have much more wisdom than I encountered there, and also the skillful means is there. And then I was also, when I thought about how I was sometimes using these for practical daily concerns, I realized that really was lacking the proper motivation, which is bodhicitta. And then the other thing that I remember when I was reviewing these teachings, I can remember when I was sitting listening to them, and I was kind of in this phase that I figured out over retreat of like, don't talk about the self-centered thought one more time. And I remember sitting there going, inside I was kind of going, not that again. This is the mistake of kind of beating ourselves up for having the self-centered thought, because that's what I analyzed it as eventually. And it has taken, because we have that pointed out so well, and when Venerable started this whole series of teachings, she beautifully laid it out. She just laid out the whole experience, and I'm going to try to recreate that because I thought it was really well done. Before she even launched into teaching and giving the background or anything, she just basically stated the problem. And in living here, we have that pointed out, which I think has been one of the most beneficial things, but maybe not the easiest. So I think it's very important, and it takes a long period of time, I think, to discern me, the person, from the self-centered thought. And when you have those together, then it's very easy to be hard on yourself, and that is not how these teachings are designed. So even when Chekawa, who was we'll get into the history a little bit for people who remember, when Chekawa was talking with Sarwa about these, he was confused about how they worked completely and needed proper guidance and instruction. And even when Atisha was learning these teachings, he spent 12 years with Sri Lingpa. And Chekawa spent something like 14 years with, so this isn't something that you just learn in a week or two. And that kind of fits my experience of this takes some years. And so I think it's good to think about it, because the slogans that make up the 7-point mind training, this text, the mind training like rays of the sun, is a commentary on the 7-point mind training. And the 7-point mind training text is embedded within this text. The 7-point mind training text is primarily short slogans. There's a whole lot of different kinds of mind training teachings. Some are short slogans and some aren't. These are short slogans. If you just use the short slogans, you probably wouldn't really understand how to employ these teachings at all. So I think the point here is that if you're using the teachings properly, it will lead you to a much happier mind. You won't be battling anything at all. And so, it just takes some guidance and proper teachings and time and practice. So I think those were my personal thoughts. When she really kind of described the problem, it was basically when she was talking about what Lama Zopa said about that our happiness or misery is on the tip of a thought. And so she started, and I started by saying that we really need to carry this awareness of using our time wisely. And these teachings help us in that regard, because we do waste a lot of time with the negative thinking, really, nam-tok, thought spinning, I mean, just so many things like that. And so there's one level where these teachings help us to think more correctly just for this life, at our level of practice in our day-to-day activities. And then there's a whole nother level where these teachings go much more deeper and profound, and actually include and incorporate the wisdom realizing emptiness. Because these teachings are about bodhicitta, they're about both conventional bodhicitta and ultimate bodhicitta. And so, although these mind training types of teachings tend to focus more on the conventional bodhicitta, they also include the ultimate bodhicitta. So, every day, the appearances of this life are so strong to us that we're just essentially caught. You know, everything seems so real. You know, the remarks that people make to us and our own perceptions, and we're just, it's amazing how strong that is. And if you aren't in, I don't know much about too many other religions, but most people I know who are in other religious traditions accept that as reality. And so that, if you believe all your thoughts and believe all your perceptions, it leads to quite a lot of misery, actually, because we have so many thoughts that are kind of bonkers and berserky. And anyone who starts doing meditation, after they hit about 3 months, they realize that. So that's then the learning starts. So these are quite strong, and we get completely caught up with them. And it's the unraveling of these that is so, I think, beneficial. But when we don't unravel them, we kind of ruminate, and we, you know, just little comments or any small little things, many of these things just bother us, and we can spend hours on them. And what's really interesting to me is that I find this so useful to think about just lately, is that something that someone says to me might take a few minutes, but I can carry it around for hours and days and weeks. And I've been reading this quote almost daily recently about this, and I just realized, really, which is more harm of the two? Is it the 3 minutes or 30 seconds that somebody says something to us, or is it the 3 great countless eons that we carry it around? Which is more harm? And if you talk to most people, they will say the problem is the other person. And as long as you carry that thought, you're going to be unhappy. And you have very little power. You know, you can't change every being. This quote also has a thing about, well, you have a few choices. You could, you know, kind of tell that person not to talk to you, and maybe they would or maybe they wouldn't, or you could kill them, and then you could start just killing everybody, but you're going to kind of run out. You know, it's really quite extreme, but it's a pretty good point. Or you could just change your own mind. You know, so often Venerable talks about in these situations that we're so caught up in, we are both the judge, the jury, the prosecutors, we're everything. You know, we take the whole thing and we put the person in jail and just throw away the key. And these are oftentimes about small little irritating things. And you can actually spend your whole life doing this. And what I'm learning most recently is that when you let these kind of disturbing thoughts obsess in your mind, you actually become pretty crabby, pretty withdrawn, pretty angry, and you get irritated quite easily. And you can live your whole life that way. And that's just such a waste. When we have this potential, we have such potential, to become fully enlightened Buddhas. I mean, once you start studying that, it's just so amazing. So how do you want to spend your time? And so these teachings, the thought training teachings, are not just they are very helpful for these day-to-day things, but the real meaning of them and the real purpose of them is to actually lead us all the way to enlightenment. So when we're in this miserable state, oftentimes instead of working with our minds, we just kind of go to our other refuges, which are like the refrigerator, the credit card, those kind of things, because we want pleasure. And that's, you can spend your life distracting yourself. You can spend your life doing many things. Some are more healthy than others. And so people who make healthier choices probably have healthier lives. But even with a person with a pretty healthy life, you can spend a lot of it just distracting yourself. You can play classical guitar. I can tell you all of my list. You can do all these things, and they're quite interesting. But and at some level, a lot of them can be just distractions, unless you're really looking at what you're doing. So if you think about the possibility of studying and listening to the Dharma and practicing and what our potential is, and then weigh how do you want to spend your time, I think that's a really interesting perspective to think about. So that leads us to looking at what's happening every moment and really looking at our thoughts, trying to be what one person said recently, the compassionate observer. I liked that expression. Looking at what is a wholesome thought and what is an unwholesome thought, and really trying to figure that out. And I think actually it's easier to do than I thought, because I spent some time this retreat when I was setting my motivation. I was using the weightiness of karma, and one of those things is when you do an action, are you doing it with distorted views? And so every day when I set my motivation, I ask myself, even about my motivation, is there something in here that's a negative that I think is a positive? And it's actually not that hard to identify when I actually think about it, because there's this feeling that's usually kind of like something's not right. There's just something there that isn't right. And just taking that time to think that way, I've actually found quite beneficial. And so I actually think if we apply ourselves to it, it's not as hard as it sounds sometimes. So it's a matter of consciously making the time to look at things. Okay. So I think we've given that some bit of a introduction. So then Venerable went on to introduce the whole topic of mind training, and she gave a background for it. And I'm just picking out some of the highlights of these first three. And the main things that we study here are Lojong, which is thought training or mind training, and Lam Rim, which is the gradual path to enlightenment. And Lo means mind or thought, and Jong of the Lojong means to train, to purify, to habituate. So this is where the whole idea of deliberately trying to train our mind. And the unique thing about this particular text that we're studying, the mind training like the rays of the sun, is that it actually combines both. And that's one of the special qualities of this text, is that it incorporates both the mind training and the actual text of the 7-point thought transformation with the commentary on it and the Lam Rim teachings. So on the day-to-day level, we use these teachings to help to transform our mind, and then as our practice progresses, we'll actually use these to help to develop deeper levels of realization, and these go beyond conceptual thought. So this would mean the direct perception of reality. So that is also included in these teachings. And then when I liked that she explained this a little bit, because I have had a little difficulty with these teachings. Sometimes I've thought they were just going to kind of sugarcoat things. And I have had some reactions to these teachings, being able to really, I mean, they're useful, they've been useful, but I've had to look at some things. And those were kind of the kind of things, are you just going to throw things out and just not look at them and throw them in a closet? I mean, are you trying to really just suppress things? What are we really trying to do here? And what she explains is that when we talk about going beyond conceptual thought, for example, and in these teachings, we're not trying to squash thoughts. We're actually, on the more day-to-day level, we're actually using our thoughts when we do mind training. We're actually at that level trying to discern what are useful and what are not useful thoughts, what are virtuous and non-virtuous, what are wholesome and unwholesome thoughts. Because we do want to cultivate good motivations, good intentions for things, and we need to actually learn how to do that. And so that is definitely using conceptual thought. And then I think the piece about sugarcoating things and that I think has a lot to do more with the wisdom side of both the ethics and the karmic side of the wisdom teachings, when we're really looking at things. And I think, it doesn't mean that we just accept harm and let people kind of run all over us and things like that. That's not what it's about at all. So this, when she talks about, it's a question of learning how to think in a correct way, a realistic way, a beneficial way. And she says what makes us unhappy is really all of our unrealistic thoughts. So there's the kind of the conventional level of that, and then there's the more subtle level of that one, when we work on the wisdom realizing emptiness. So this text in particular, and in general I think mind training texts deal with two main topics. And the first one is to how to transform difficulties into the path to enlightenment, which she just started touching on at the very end of these three talks. And the second one is how to counteract the self-centered thought, this thought that's always concerned with I, me, mine. My happiness is most important. I'm the center of the universe. I'm entitled to everything. I want what I want when I want it. And when this doesn't happen, we have this great sense of entitlement. And we self-reference everything around this. Everything is in reference to me, my, mine. And this type of thinking is basically the root of most of our problems. And it's not something that you can legislate away. It's something that you have to work on within yourself, with help and with teachings. But we have to realize that the problem isn't outside of us. The problem is in our own thinking. And that's actually can be, I think, quite a useful thing at some point. I mean, for me personally, this last retreat was very helpful in this way. In terms of, I find now that it comes up in my mind quite strongly when I'm kind of not in a great place and kind of working it out and kind of moving towards the positive. Stop blaming others. And when I come to that, I am really have turned the corner. And it's so helpful, and my mind is so much happier, and it changes so quickly. And this is the thing. It's a matter of, it's so easy to blame, and even blaming ourselves. You just have to let go of all the blame. And it's interesting to realize how fickle we are in all of these things, because one afternoon we're blaming one person, so they kind of become our enemy, and then the next day they're our best, they're our friend, and we're just, everything is jumping all around like this. It's just so, I think it's helpful to realize this, because when you watch that happen so much, you can't not notice how illogical it all is, and that the problem isn't them, because they really aren't changing that much. It's our conceptions that change. And if they were as good or as bad as we think they are in a moment, and they were permanently like that, everyone would see it that way, and it's absolutely not the case. And so those kind of ways of analyzing and looking at things, I think, really shore up these teachings, and they help us to see that there's not an external enemy. And we're not the enemy. The enemy, the problem, the thief that steals our happiness is the afflictions, is these self-centered thoughts, things like that. So when the self-centered mind is kind of running the show, then there's just so much conflict and problems, and we feel so unhappy, and our ego is just so sensitive. What do people think of me? Do they like me? We're just so, do I fit in? All those kind of things. We're always then worrying. We spin around thinking about ourselves. It's just all me, me, me. Oh yeah, Amy used to say, me, 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 me. I liked that. A friend of mine, we were learning about this. I thought that worked. So we have our personal dramas and all of our self-pity things going on, and that pretty much, when you're in that state of mind, you can just know that, it's not, it's just thoughts, it's not who you are, and you're going to be miserable as long as you keep thinking that way. I think I went through a period once, it was about a year ago, where I was not very happy about something. And I think this is when I really started to learn this, because I would analyze it the same way, and I did it a number of times, and I would always come to the same miserable conclusion every time. I did this probably 20 times, literally. And I was like, because I was quite unhappy about something, and I just, I was like, this has got to change. So I keep trying to figure it out, and I always come to the same conclusion. Then, Simke told me to write a letter to the children and get it worked out, and that helped. Anyway, that was funny. But I learned something that, you think you run your mind through the same thought pattern, you come to the same conclusion every time. After a while, this is, like knocking your head against the wall. You start realizing you don't really want to do that. Okay, so then she went into the history. So that's a little bit about the self-centered thought and what our enemy is, what really we need to try to discern and dismantle, and what these teachings actually help us with. So then the history of this, basically there were a number of texts, there are many texts. In fact, there's a monk I met in Seattle who told me that the texts from mind training are about this tall. We only have, maybe this many translated. I only know of maybe 10 that are translated into English. But he said once to me, if you stack up the mind training text, the Tibetan ones, they're like, there's tons of them. So there's a lot, I think, that haven't been translated. But the principal text, the most well-known one, is the 7-point thought transformation, which is incorporated into the text we're studying. And that text was many versions of it. The history is a little unclear, but many versions of it exist, apparently. And the one that is in our text, I'm pretty sure, is from Czechia. But there were different ones that were made, and what happened is that they essentially came originally from Atisha into Tibet. And so we'll go into the history of that depending on how the time goes tonight. So it's basically just the brief history is that they were considered to be oral instructions, but they weren't written down at the time of Atisha. They were written down much later. It was Czechia who first wrote them. And the 7-point thought training is the one that is the short phrases. And so there are different versions, and the phrases vary. Let's see. So the 7-point thought training has 7 points, which I just will list because this is what we will be going through as we go through the whole text. We're really we're in the first point of 7 in terms of these 3 talks. So the first one is explaining the preliminaries as a basis for the practice. And the second point is the actual practice, which is training in the awakening mind, which has both the ultimate and the conventional bodhicitta. So the third one is transforming adverse circumstances into the path. The fourth is the integrated practice of a single lifetime, which is how to put them into practice. The fifth is the measure of having trained the mind. The sixth is the commitments of mind training, and the seventh is the precepts of mind training. So as we go through this text, those will be the things that we cover. So, as I said, these teachings emphasize primarily the conventional bodhicitta. And as we have been learning, there are 2 ways to develop it. Everybody knows the 2 ways. We've been quizzed on this. The 7-point instruction of cause and effect, and the equalizing and exchanging self for others. This particular text that we're studying comes from the tradition of the equalizing and exchanging self for others, which is from Shantideva via Nagarjuna. And when Venerable was teaching this, she quoted that something that His Holiness had said, which she found particularly touching, which was, "My fellow Buddhists, brothers and sisters, please, if you really want to practice, study Shantideva's text, Guide to a Bodhisattva's Way of Life." So this is really telling us what practice, the importance of it. So the equalizing and exchanging self for others, which is the means of developing bodhicitta in this text, is what really strikes directly at the self-centered mind that we've been discussing. So there are different levels of the self-centered mind that Venerable explained, and the one we're most familiar with is the more gross one, which is I, me, mine. But then there's a more subtle one of the arhats, who actually still carry a bit of the self-centered mind, which is that their liberation is so important that they're just going to go to nirvana and that's it. So they feel that their liberation is more important than others. So that's a very subtle type of self-centered thought. Okay. Twice when Venerable taught in the first 3 times, she said, maybe we should keep a little tally during the day of how often we get aggravated or irritated or annoyed, which I didn't do. But what I did do was I used the next part, which was say to yourself, my self-centered thought fooled me again. And I actually liked that. That was useful. Because when you're in it, when you're in the midst of it, you're so in it, and you can't laugh about anything. I can't anyway. But when I say that to myself, it actually kind of makes me chuckle, like, here we go again. It's kind of like, and so my self-centered thought fooled me again. So I thought that was actually a useful tool to share. So then we move on to, she starts getting a little bit more into the text, because she actually hasn't read from the text yet until we get a ways into things. And the author Nam Kapel starts with an homage and a request. And one thing he says is, at all times I take refuge in and prostrate at the feet of the sublime and infinitely compassionate spiritual masters. Out of their immense love, may they care for me in every moment of my life. And then Venerable said, and isn't that beautiful? And then she went on to teach us, make her commentary, which I think is quite useful. And she told a story of her own. But basically what she was wanting us to understand is, well, how is it that our spiritual mentors are kind to us? How do they care for us every moment of our life? And, if you look at your own mind, what do you want? We want praise. We want to be appreciated. We want all these things that we never get. Not remembering. But that isn't really the point. You know, they are here to teach us the Dharma. That's the, you know, teaching us and guiding us and inspiring us. Those are the kindnesses of the teacher. Even when we do one of our Lamrim prayers in the Lama Chopa, the 3 kindnesses, I think those are the actual 3. And giving us our vows, so I might have memorized those wrong. But basically, the main function of our teachers is to inspire us, to teach and guide us, and to give us, and if they're monastics, to give precepts. And then she also said that whether your teacher is teaching you individually or whether you're sitting in a crowd, like say you're a student of His Holiness and he's teaching to thousands of people, everything is a personal instruction. And so even if he's giving advanced teachings that are more advanced than your capability, it's still a personal instruction, but it doesn't mean that you're going to focus and practice that. You know, you just go to the level where you're at so that you have the proper foundation for any teachings that come your way. She told a story about when Khensur Jampa Tekchok sent her a letter that she did exactly what she's teaching us not to do. So it was a really good story. But what was interesting about that is what she said is that once she had worked it through, she realized that what he was telling her was really good advice. You know, at first she was kind of like, why is he telling me this? Am I all, you know? He was telling her not to teach, to be careful when she taught about the 8 worldly concerns. So she was thinking, maybe he was thinking she had all of those. And then she went on to say that actually until you get to the path of seeing, you will be dealing with the 8 worldly concerns. So these things, to my mind, are quite helpful to realize that, you know, you're going to be contending with the issues of, you know, reputation and gain and loss and, you know, all those kind of things until you get to the path of seeing. So, you know, that's a long haul. Don't be unrealistic. And then the teachings moved into talking about Lama Atisha, which I think when I've thought about all the people they discussed in this, I'm quite thinking he was the most amazing in a way in terms of what he did. And he's one of the great masters in the Tibetan tradition, although he's from from India. I think he might be from Bengal, Prince from Bengal. Anyway, he was a great scholar, was part of the university Vikramashila, one of the great monastic universities. From him came the Kadampa tradition. So he was in Tibet in the 10th and 11th centuries at a time when he was invited to go there because they needed things revitalized. Usually religions kind of go through periods of expansion and decline and degeneration, and so they need some, you know, cleaning up every once in a while. So he was very, very skilled in terms of all of the philosophical texts and had profound understanding of them. And he was also a tantric practitioner. But when he was in Tibet, what he mostly taught and what we have from him in Tibet are the actual teachings that we follow the most, which are the Lojong, the mind training, and the Lamrim teachings. And he was the gradual path to enlightenment teachings. And he was the first person who really organized those. And so these are very practical teachings. He didn't teach in a way of debate or any of that. And part of the reason Venerable was thinking why is because they didn't have much need for debate in a sense that everyone was pretty much Buddhist. Whereas in India, the function of debate partly was initially because there were so many different traditions. And his favorite topics were refuge and karma. I think that says a lot. He also carried an altar with a little stupa with him that he would just stop and purify immediately. when things happen, which Venerable Chodron has a photograph of. So he's quite inspiring, and that's just a little bit about him. And the source of these teachings, although it's, you know, the written ones are traced back to Atisha, they actually go all the way back to Nagarjuna and the Precious Garland. And so the quote from the Precious Garland, that's the most direct one, is, "May their evil bear fruit for me, may all my virtue bear fruit for others," which is basically the taking and giving meditation that we do. So it's interesting that, so Geshe Chekawa was the first person, he's the one that started writing this down and teaching it, and it was pretty much an oral lineage before that, and it was considered secret. And this was interesting to me, and I've thought about this because my own experience has been that when I've tried to explain these teachings sometimes to people who have like no background, they don't understand them always very well. And that's actually what Venerable was saying, is that the reason they were secret is because that people have a hard time understanding them sometimes. And I can clearly remember trying to tell somebody once just the simple thing that everyone wants to be happy and no one wants to suffer, and they were like, "So what? I'm still mad." You know, it was, you know, maybe I wasn't so skillful, but you know, I think that fits my experience sometimes. That, you know, so anyway, that's what happened. They weren't written down for quite a while. Okay. So she went into some different topics, and one of them, I kind of labeled this the whole aim of the Buddha's teachings. And Namkapel said this: "In general, the 84,000 collections of Buddhist teachings, or the 3 progressive turnings of the wheel of the doctrine taught by the Buddha, can all be condensed into 2 intentions: to put an end to all types of mental distortion with regard to the I, or the misconception of self, and to acquaint ourselves with an altruistic attitude through which we take responsibility for the welfare of others." So basically what he's saying is that all of the teachings of the Buddha fall into wisdom teachings and bodhicitta teachings. And so she then went on to explain, I guess this was the part where they were using the beginning of the text kind of as the advertisement, you know, to get us all interested in the teachings, and how these teachings can lead to becoming fully awakened with a fully omniscient mind, which is also called non-abiding nirvana. And she mentioned that this term comes up quite often, and she thought it would be a good idea for us to learn these terms because they come up in many teachings. So she went on to explain that non-abiding nirvana is different from the ordinary nirvana. So when an arhat becomes an arhat, let's put it that way, they have nirvana with remainder, and then they die, and then they have nirvana without remainder. And those are mainly what she would then term the ordinary nirvana, which is liberation. But the non-abiding nirvana is actually special because it doesn't abide in either of the 2 extremes of samsara or pacification. Those are the 2 extremes in that situation. So samsara is living in a situation where our minds are completely controlled, I mean, you know, almost completely controlled by, or overwhelmed, let's put it that way, not controlled, by afflictions and karma. So we're always taking continual rebirth, these berserky minds. And the other extreme is pacification, where, you know, you're in such a peaceful state, you can check out, essentially. And so this is non-abiding nirvana is neither of those extremes. So it's actually full Buddhahood. It's the same thing. And then the text went into this quote. In general, the term nectar in the text refers to the elixir which provides immortality. So here, just as a proficient doctor, when diagnosing an illness, prescribes a medicine that can relieve the patient of his sickness and even prevent his death, so the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras tell of the finest type of medicine, even the smell of which is said to drive away the most venomous of snakes. And so she went into then 3 topics which she repeated. So the first one was very brief, which is the analogy that we're pretty familiar with of the doctor, the Buddha as the doctor, the Dharma as the medicine. And the Dharma here was really the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, and the nurses as the community. And so one of the points was that even a small amount of your practice that can incorporate the Perfection of Wisdom teachings, even a small amount will challenge self-grasping. And that's the point of this, even the smell of which is said to drive away the most venomous of snakes. That's what that refers to in that quote. And then the second thing that she went over was, it says in here that, let's see, the precious awakening mind is the supreme essence of any spiritual endeavor, the nectar providing the state of immortality. And so she wanted us to really understand clearly, why is it bodhicitta, the supreme essence of any spiritual endeavor? We had the discussion about why isn't it renunciation? Why isn't it wisdom? And the reason is that those two aren't really the causes of Buddhahood. You need them, but the cause of Buddhahood and even entering the Mahayana, being a bodhisattva, is bodhicitta. And then twice she explained at some length about immortality in Buddhism. And so what does it really mean when we talk about this? Because nirvana is sometimes called the deathless state. And so what are we talking about there? And she wasn't really saying that, like when most people think about immortality, they kind of think you're never going to die. We went into this whole thing of, do you want to keep this body forever? Cryogenics. But that isn't it. What it really means is that you're never born again in cyclic existence. So you're never going to face death again in cyclic existence. But there is this, that kind of immortality that is nirvana. But it's not like you're living in this body forever. Your mind stream will continue on, and if you aspire and achieve full enlightenment, then you'll never have a birth with afflictions and karma, and you'll have the possibility to manifest and make emanations that help people. So that's really our goal. It's not to live forever, so to speak, with this body and this mind. Then the text goes a lot more into the history, which I'm just going to touch on parts of, and some of the points that she made. And it started with Atisha's great faith in Sri Lanka. So Atisha traveled, as we all know, to get these teachings. He had to go to Indonesia, and he took him like, how long? 12 years. He was there 12 years. It took a long time to get there. Can't remember now. Anyway, it was very dangerous, and he spent it was difficult to do. I forgot the length of that. And the thing that was, I think, kind of unique about that is that it was Sri Lanka who had the lineages of the complete spiritual systems of Nagarjuna, Asanga, and Shantideva, much like the confluence of 3 great rivers. And so maybe that's why he had to go there. I think that's what she talked about, because Sri Lanka had all those lineages in one. and the texts that she cited, the text that each of those wrote. And then the teaching that she gave about this was really about his faith, because these are the things that, and this is what I really, one of the main points I took from these 3 teachings was this part. And Atisha had many teachers, but whenever he spoke of Sri Lingpa, he always would put his hands together, and sometimes he would even have tears, because it was Sri Lingpa who taught him bodhicitta, and he spent 12 years there. And she explained to us how, and His Holiness has done this too, this example is brought up quite often as a point for us to think about and contemplate, the importance of which is that Sri Lingpa was, I think, a mind-only philosophy, and Atisha was Madhyamaka. So they, about a very important thing, they held different ideas. And so that's quite meaningful, both that Atisha had this pure faith in him, and they held different philosophical views, and it was like no hindrance at all. Just not at all. It didn't change their spiritual relationship at all. And she said that, it's, I think what I took out of this teaching was, living here with the teacher, or even if you're in close proximity, or you're working on projects with a teacher, things come up, and all these little minutia things that drive you crazy, And a couple times in these 3 teachings, she talked about that these things that happen are really not important in the scope of things. There's just things of this life. And we really need to take a much bigger view on things. The speed you drive at was one of her examples, because, all these little things of living with other people, they're really not important issues. Her exact words were, those are not important issues. Yet sometimes our faith is so fragile that we lose it because our teacher has a difference of opinion. How to respond to a letter, what color to make this, these things that we live with every day. And she mentioned this at another time too, when she was talking about, no, I can't remember the example now. Yeah, and yeah, she has different philosophical views than a lot of her teachers, political views. So that's the faith that we see that Atisha had. That's why I think they bring up that example, because it's such a, confidence. So she said, this is something to remember. I found that particularly helpful, because it made me just put things in a much bigger perspective, which is always good for my mind. So Sri Lingpa had the lineage from Nagarjuna, Asanga, and Shantideva. He imparted those to Atisha, and then Atisha, before he left for Tibet, he visited Bodh, and if you go to Bodh, you'll see this statue of Tara that is built into the stupa. I think that's the actual statue. When I was there, I imagined it was. I thought about Atisha when I was there, and it was just mind-blowing to be walking right where the Buddha had walked, right where Atisha had walked, right in front of this statue, and like, this is the statue that talked to Atisha. Because Atisha and Tara was, I think, his principal deity. And so he had a little conversation, and he knew his life would be shorter if he went to Tibet, but it would be of great benefit. And so, of all the people I read about in here, he was the most amazing in terms of what he really did and what he gave. Quite amazing. So we do have to thank him, because we wouldn't have these teachings. And then he had many, many disciples from India, Kashmir, Irgan, I don't know how to say that, Nepal, Tibet. And of them, it was Drone Topa who was the one who really carried his teachings the most, especially for these mind training ones. Drongtopa is the one who was a lay person, but he also made a monastery, and it was in that same area where Lama Tsongkhapa, I think it was the same monastery they were talking about, where when Lama Tsongkhapa started writing the Lamrim Jummo, it was the same place. And Venerable has visited there, and I think it's up in the hills there where she talks about the letters that come out of the rocks, and she said it was quite an amazing place. And Urgen is the same place where Padmasambhava was from, which she said is in part of northern Pakistan. So Drongtopa carried along the teachings from Atisha, and his main student who brought these teachings along was Potoa. And then it was Potoa who was considered to be one of the 16 Arhats, considered to be an emanation. And he had many students. He was one of the three noble brothers. And it was in this time period, this part I didn't understand fully, it wasn't explained here, and I looked it up, but I didn't ever really figure it out. But it was, I'm sorry, I have to back up there. So Potoa studied the 6 original scriptures. So there were 6 scriptures which are mostly about bodhicitta, that are the main texts that were studied in the Kadam tradition. And this is one of the things that he's well known for, because he taught these very often and had realizations of them, so he could teach them. And they were primarily about bodhicitta. And bodhicitta was the heart of his practice. And he had over 2,000 disciples. So these teachings, what I notice is they kind of grow, the number of disciples that all these people had, and so they seem to have been carried quite well. The lineage is quite strong. So although Atisha started the Kadam tradition, it was Drongtopa who carried it on, and at that point there were 3 lineages. And I'll just list them first and then tell some stories that she told that were, I think, useful for our practice. So the first one was the Kadam Lamrimpa, which is mainly the Lamrim teachings. The second one is the scriptural Kadampas, which is what Potoa's lineage was. And then the third is the lineage of the Pith instructions. And so the Kadam Lamrimpa, they studied the Lamrim, and which was at that point, I think, primarily Atisha's lamp to the path of enlightenment. And what she said is they practiced them as if the Buddha had given them to them. So they took them very personally as teachings directly handed from the Buddha to them. It was the Buddha who gave me the teachings. So that gave them probably tremendous inspiration to put them into practice. So they didn't study as much the philosophical texts. That was more the scriptural Kadampas. And this is the main point that she made about this, is she wanted us to be very clear, important to remember, that when Potoa and all of these geshes study the Indian philosophical texts, they integrate it into their practice. They integrate it into the path. She said if you don't integrate things, it's like living in a desert. That's how bleak I think your internal world would be. And I think we've actually seen that some in our experience here, when sometimes people come and they have a more intellectual grasp of the teachings, but then they kind of try to do a 3-month retreat and they haven't learned how to work with their mind with the teachings. So they have these intellectual understandings but have a difficult time using them because they're here, they haven't got them here. And that's just, you learn. If you stick with it, you learn with guidance, proper guidance and proper teachings. So what she wanted us to, what she was saying is, don't approach these texts just as an intellectual inquiry. There's some people, and we've kind of seen this some, they're just very intellectually engaging, fun to debate, you learn all these concepts. So then she told the story about Paul Gatso, the monk who was imprisoned in Tibet for 30 years, the one who wrote the autobiography of a Tibetan monk. And she told the story about one time when the Chinese communist prison guards were really bearing down on them. There was a geshe there, so they were being threatened. And there was a geshe there who just, there was a lot of cruelty and torture. And he just got down and, was just pleading and pleading and pleading for his life, which I think I would do. But the thing is the people who had been able to take the teachings and really integrate them into his life, and this person was a geshe, so he had studied for at least 25 years, I would say, because in that time period, I don't think you could get a geshe degree in less amount of time. But Paulden Galto was saying that he was really kind of disheartened and shocked by it, because he was aware that the teachings hadn't been integrated. He might have understood them intellectually, but he hadn't been able to make them help him with his mind and his experience, his day-to-day experience. So this is the thing about all of the Buddha's teachings. They're to be put into practice. So then the third one was the lineage of pith instructions. And on that one, she said, oh yeah, that was kind of interesting. Basically that people practice differently, so they need different kinds of teachings. And in Buddhism, there are many different kinds of ways of practice, and it fits the dispositions of people. And when the Buddha taught, and His Holiness always brings this up, that the Buddha taught to the disposition of the person right in front of him. And that's a very important point. So then, so we've gotten as far as Potawa in the lineage, and then we go to Sharawa. We're going to be done here pretty soon. Sharawa is the teacher that Chekawa received the teachings from, and she told us the beautiful story of that, which is really worth rereading when they actually speak about it, because Chekawa had gotten the 8 verses of thought transformation. He was totally inspired by them. He talked to all his friends, where should I go? And so he said, go to the source, and they gave him 2 people's names. He found Sharawa. Sharawa was just teaching on the fundamental vehicle, didn't say a word about bodhicitta, and he was like in despair. He was just like so bummed out. And so he decided to talk to him, and he did in a very polite and respectful way. And it ended up that basically Sharawa said, well, it wasn't suited for these people, and he let him know that the source was Nagarjuna. And then Chekawa became a student of Sharawa for, I think it was like 14 years or something. And then through there, these teachings have been brought to us. And it's not too far from Chekawa to get down to the author of this book, because the book we're studying is written by a student of Lama Tsongkhapa's. And he explains the lineage, but he actually, Namkapel, who wrote Mind Training Like the Rays of the Sun, had received a number of lineages. I think they were quite intact. And so he had teachings from Tsongkhapa, and he had teachings directly, like 3 people away from Chekawa, including Tongme Zangpo, who wrote the 37 Practices of Bodhisattvas. It was his translator who taught Namkapel. So the teachings are very much in a direct lineage. And the reason that's so emphasized, like when I'm at the Sakya Monastery, in the prayers you're reciting these names, is because you don't want, Venerable's point was, you don't want something that somebody made up last week. So they always were trying to go back. Chekawa was asking Sharawa, and they explained the whole conversation in the text, where did these teachings come from, and will they lead me to enlightenment? He just didn't want anything. And so I think in ending, I think the last big point she made, which I'll make rather quickly, is that the main thing that's kind of amazing about these teachings is that they can lead us to enlightenment, and in part of that we can transform difficulties into the path. And so through these teachings, we have the opportunity to train our minds in a way that anything that happens, we can take into the path to enlightenment, all the way to becoming fully awakened. So that's pretty darn amazing. I think that pretty well covers it.